So I want to give you guys a little bit of background on this very topic. So almost a month ago, millions of internet-connected devices became part of a huge denial of service attack. So popular websites like Twitter, Netflix, Spotify, GitHub, and PayPal were offline for several hours. So after the attack, the hackers who had commandeered these IoT devices released the source code to the malware, which is called Mirai, which means that anyone could use it for a bigger attack in the future. A House hearing yesterday delved into the issue of IoT security, and several lawmakers said that they were reluctant to get the government involved in regulating this issue. So one of the witnesses, security technologist Bruce Schneider, said, quote, "I actually think we need a new agency. We can't have different rules if a computer makes calls, or a computer has wheels, or if it's in your body. The government is getting involved here regardless, because the stakes are too high. The choice isn't between government involvement and no government involvement. It's between good government involvement and stupid government involvement. I'm not a regulatory fan, but this is the world of dangerous things." That's a typical Schneider quote, actually. He's very quote-worthy. So I actually want to turn my first question to Thomas McDermott, who's with DHS. And why don't you talk a little bit about your role at DHS?
Sure. I am the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Cyber Policy Office at DHS. So my office is very focused on issues of cyber policy. And obviously the Internet of Things is at the forefront of what the administration is sort of focusing on and thinking about what are the sort of the policy issues that are coming down the road that we need to worry about going forward. And so I think one of the things that my office has recently been focused on is this question of the Internet of Things and how should we be thinking about how to better secure the Internet of Things. I think you always have to start the conversation with pointing out just sort of the tremendous promise that the IoT provides, whether it's wearable devices, to medical devices, to autonomous cars, to smart cities. I mean, IoT has the potential to really change the way that we live our lives and for the better. But with that increased connectedness comes a growing threat, a growing risk, and dependencies and vulnerabilities that we need to account for. So my office actually just earlier this week issued a document that sort of set forward some strategic principles about how to secure the Internet of Things. That was really meant to start the conversation about how the IoT community, the government, other federal agencies, not just the Department of Homeland Security, but other agencies, should be thinking about how to secure the Internet of Things, how device manufacturers, IoT developers, consumers should think about the Internet of Things, and what are the principles that we can all sort of start and have a conversation about how to move forward in a way with IoT where security is really sort of built in, and that we're not trying to figure out how 5 or 10 years from now how to go back and retrofit devices and retrofit the ecosystem so that it is more secure.
So I want to ask you, John, you are with IOActive. What's your role there?
So I'm the VP of Strategic Services at IOActive, and for those who don't know what IOActive is a consultancy. It's largely a company of hackers, so we do offensive security work. Organizations hire us to break into their products, into their environments, and let them know what vulnerabilities they have.
So let's talk a little bit about what are some of the existing threats and vulnerabilities in IoT?
So that's a great question. Thomas talked about some of the areas where IoT exists today. So the oldest and longest that we can think of as Internet-enabled or connected devices is traditional industrial control systems. And so those are involved in our critical infrastructure from rail to oil and gas, trucking, the power generation utility space. Those issues have been dealt with for a while. There are still lots of very significant vulnerabilities in all those devices. We have seen the threats in that particular area emerge very recently with the Russian attack on the Ukrainian high voltage transmission lines. So that's a very, very specific and recent example of a threat and a vulnerability coming together to have a high impact. Some of the other areas we're seeing some very initial threats. So some of the consumer-enabled IoT devices like home thermostats, they have pervasive vulnerabilities. They have lots of design flaws. They're not designed securely. They're not managed in a secure manner. and they're relatively inexpensive devices that we might think are throwaway. Dave Eitel refers to it as the Internet of Junk in this regard because they're low-cost consumer devices. We're seeing some initial active exploitation within the consumer IoT space. So exploitation of those devices by nation states for persistence, surveillance, and monitoring of individuals. The vehicle space is one that has very recently seen some researchers demonstrate some very significant and impactful vulnerabilities within that space. But as of today, the threats are relatively minimal on the cyber vector to transportation. However, if we look back at the recent attack on US Transcom by the Chinese, that is a specific example where with very little additional level of effort, that threat actor can have a disproportionate impact on the cyber attack within the transportation sector.
Mm-hmm. And let's go back to the hearing yesterday. The main topic was pretty much regulation. And Josh, you're with the Center for Data Innovation, so you're involved on the policy side. So do you see IoT as an area for government regulation as it was done for the problem with spam email, for example?
Sure. For those who don't know, the Center for Data Innovation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy think tank focusing on data, technology, and public policy. And our whole philosophy when it comes to the Internet of Things is that we know it's going to be an incredible driver of economic and social benefits. It has particularly valuable applications for the public sector, just like it does for the private sector. So we really want to see the government's role in this be spurring adoption internally and supporting the broader ecosystem as a whole. And so regulation does have a very important role to play in that. But we think the conversation around whether it's cybersecurity or whether it's even privacy is focused almost disproportionately on preventing bad behavior and not focused enough on incentivizing good behavior. So one of the things we'd really like to see from a regulatory perspective is one, regulatory clarity, because if you're a startup, if you're a company building these devices and you are unsure how agencies will react to your products, just because they're not using clear terms, they're using phrases like security by design, which sounds great, but without specifics, it's not really useful as a regulatory tool. Security becomes a check off the box kind of situation rather than actually caring about security. You're just avoiding regulatory scrutiny. You're not trying to protect consumers.
Mm-hmm. And Thomas, you're nodding your head there.
Yeah, so I think that we are certainly seeing, as Bruce alluded to in his testimony yesterday, which I haven't had the chance to see yet, we are increasingly seeing more federal agencies sort of paying attention to the Internet of Things space, whatever that means, whether it's the Federal Trade Commission looking at it from a sort of consumer protection angle, or you've got the National Highway Safety Transportation Administration looking at sort of autonomous cars from a safety perspective. So I think it's sort of inevitable that there's going to be sort of additional conversations about sort of what's the right regulatory lever. And I think that one of the challenges in that space is just that IoT means different things to different people, and it's such a sort of broad and diverse really concept. Sort of what's the right approach, and can there be a one-size-fits-all approach? I mean, again, the Department of Homeland Security product that we issued this week is decidedly not regulatory, and it's really at a very high level, a strategic level, trying to sort of lay out some of the principles that can sort of really start the conversation, and then we can start thinking about, is there a way to apply those more uniformly across the board, or does it need to be a more sort of sector-specific approach, depending on sort of what type of device or what type of ecosystem of devices we're talking about.
And those are really voluntary guidelines.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. Absolutely.
John, what do you see as the proper approach to address the risks posed by these IoT?
So I think it's breaking IoT down by vertical industry. And so again, going back to the transportation, the vehicle industry, there's a lot of industry groups where they're engaged in very active self-governance and self-regulation around these issues. So SAE, Society of Automotive Engineers, is putting together a number of best practices documents that are becoming standards within SAE for how suppliers within that automotive and vehicle supply chain go about performing cybersecurity. I think one of the most important things to understand is there can be lots of failures when it comes to regulatory specifications about security. I always look at PCI as a good example of this. And this is also an example where the industry has been self-regulating to a large degree, but it's primarily been an effort to transfer risk from the clearing organizations to the organizations that are interacting with the customers, the mom and pop shops and the large organizations who are taking the credit cards. That has largely become an environment where it's primarily about compliance. It is not about security. Compliance is not sufficient to have security. But risk, threats, and vulnerabilities are not static. So whenever we put in stone a specific set of guidelines, whether it's a strategy, approach, or very specific proscriptive and prescriptive technical specifications, as soon as they are written, they become outdated. I, as an attacker, actively look to those to exploit. So I look for, what are they defending against? Thank you, you're telling me the strong points. I'm going to attack the weak points. You're really giving me a map of where not to waste my time looking. There's other areas that I can exploit. So I think the best approach is to develop an awareness and a programmatic approach within an organization. Take the security mindset, it's a subset of overall quality, institute that within the organization, have a programmatic approach to security for the organization that is operationalized, that involves all the aspects of the business. Primarily, the point is you want operational resiliency. So security really, along with quality, gives you operational resilience. Security is very important, but at the end of the day, you can still be an insecure organization and fulfill your mission and be able to do what you need to do to handle your customers' needs or to fulfill your mandates. So I would counsel an approach that focuses on developing the right culture throughout the organization, where you're going to focus on operational resilience.
So given the tradition of outsourcing technical expertise, such as programming, to industry experts, what is the right balance of skills for government regulators and policy experts, and how do we ensure informed and experienced participation in these critical issues?
Again, I think that's a great question. There are very stark cultural differences between those who regulate things, those who make things, and those who break things. Getting them to come together does happen, but it is a very difficult conversation to move in a productive manner. I like to refer to some of the folks in our industry as black-collar workers, largely because they prefer to wear black T-shirts. So that putting them in a room, putting them next to somebody who's wearing a suit and a tie, has some very significant barriers to effective communication. So producing the right forum to provide for the free exchange of ideas, ensure that folks are working towards a common goal is the most important thing to do there. Absolutely, the outside experts need to be involved. They need to have a stake and they need to have a voice. Any type of decisions that are made where all the stakeholders are involved is going to have a much more productive outcome than where it's a subset of those stakeholders.
Thomas, how does your office in particular work with outside people, and do you actually work with the black shirts?
There's no black shirts in the government. So, I think certainly my office tries to engage broadly with the stakeholder community to understand sort of how these really sort of complicated policy issues and questions around how to best secure IoT come to the forefront, and how we can sort of move forward together. I guess one of the points that we've repeatedly tried to make in our engagement with stakeholders is we should build upon the principles that work in the security community sort of writ large when we're talking about how to secure IoT. And I think one area where we have had some success is getting large corporations to understand that security is not something off on the side, that really security is sort of fundamental to what their business is and how their organization needs to be structured. And that it's become a little cliche, right? But like security and cybersecurity have to be a boardroom issue, not just sort of the black shirt issue. And I think that taking that mentality and finding out how to apply that into the IoT space is going to be critical in an environment that is largely much more sort of smaller players, the sort of more of a startup mentality. And I think one of the things that we hope to move towards is a world where security becomes thought of as part of IoT products and potentially as a market differentiator, and not just, I am trying to be innovative and come up with great new ideas for IoT, and God, the security guys keep trying to get me worried about security at the same time, right? That really the thinking about security is part of how you think about your product and the services that you're delivering to your customers.
Josh, how do you work with those people outside of your think tank?
So earlier this year, we conducted a pretty lengthy survey with about a couple dozen people within the federal government, a couple dozen people that worked with companies that contract to the government developing IoT services. And we asked them, like, what is the government doing well when it comes to IoT? Do they know what they're talking about? Are they willing to invest in these products? Can they handle the risks? And one of the overwhelming responses from people in the federal agencies who wanted to remain anonymous and from these companies is that there's a lack of strategic leadership in terms of getting the government on board with knowing what to do with IoT. So it could be even simple as something as symbolic as like in the Federal CIO Council having an IoT working group just to tell agencies and regulators, this is how you need to be thinking about the Internet of Things, this is what it can do for you, this is what you need to be wary of. But across the board, pretty much no one's there just yet, unfortunately.
So far we've heard about attacks that take over IoT devices for things like denial of service attacks. Are you thinking more about the advanced persistent threats that take our sensor, video, etc. data and use them for more advanced attacks? So for instance, if you have an automatic license plate reader, if that were compromised, you can actually track the location of certain individuals. How can we stop that from happening?
So I think that's a great question, and it's a difficult one to answer. We can't ever stop anything completely. What we can do is we can take a layered security approach, we can identify the risk, we can manage the risk appropriately, and we can constrain the threat actors who are capable of those types of things to a small pool. When there are a small pool of tier 5 and tier 6 threat actors, that's something the government knows how to deal with. The focus there should primarily be on protecting devices from the lower tier threat actors, the tier 1s through the tier 4s. That's, I think, the manufacturers, the developers of those products' responsibilities. Helping to ensure that the devices are secure with a secure design process, focused on operational resiliency, those are very, very important. But you're absolutely right. The Defense Science Board had a paper last year that called the IoT one of the potential strategic surprise vectors. And so that's an issue that we as an organization and as a country and nation, as a world, have to really look at. I think there's a couple of issues along that topic. Some of them being these devices, even if they're very passive and they're only focused on very limited sensing environments, have the capability to act as a reservoir of infection. So an environment can be penetrated, peers, the denied area can be compromised through the use of one of these devices. So while you can lock your phone or your tablet in a locker when you go in a skiff, someone who has an implantable medical device like a Bluetooth-enabled insulin pump or a pacemaker, they can't lock that in the locker. So this is an area where those devices can bridge across denied areas, close the air gap. Another concern I think that we need to look at related to this is figuring out how to stop the proliferation of cyber weapons. So this is an issue that has been given much discussion in the space today, but I'll frame it in this manner. So we, within the nuclear space, there are very significant and complex constraints to being able to develop an endogenous nuclear capability within a country. They also have a high degree of traceability due to the way those materials are produced. But the efforts to physically separate a different isotope of uranium is very significant. Those barriers do not exist in the cyberspace. They do not exist in the IoT space. You'll find that some of the best work today, at least publicly, is done by individuals. You think about an organized group and what they can build, there's a very significant capability for even small groups with limited funding to build very sophisticated capabilities in this space. So very similar to my comment earlier, we want to constrain the pool of actors who have those capabilities to significant actors who are geolocated and are strategic thinkers. We don't want individuals who have no specific home or area of operation who've infiltrated society to be able to develop and maintain these capabilities over a long period of time. And so I think that's another thing that we can do that can very drastically shift the balance of the threat and constrain it to a more manageable level at a nation-state basis.
And I think you definitely are involved in those discussions about the worst case scenario.
Sure.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, I guess maybe I always think in threes, but I guess I think of three main kind of risks that I worry about in terms of IoT. The first is sort of the protection of data and the consumer data and the possibility that information that is collected by and transmitted by an IoT device could be stolen or compromised. So sort of loss of data is the first. The second is the possibility that either devices won't work when you need them to work, or they will be taken over and function in a way that's other than the way you want them to function. So sort of a device malfunction or non-function. And the third is what we sort of started with, which is the case where an IoT device is used sort of, for lack of a better term, as a weapon to harm a third party. So those are sort of the three buckets of risks that I typically think of in terms of IoT. I also think in terms of sort of three threat actors that we worry about. The first are sort of the constantly evolving clever criminal element who will find sort of new ways to use technology for criminal purposes. And there you can think in terms of both theft and selling of data, or also the growing threat of ransomware and ransomware associated with IoT. And when you talk about sort of worst cases, and this becomes the stuff of movies, right? But the idea of ransomware associated with medical devices, right? So if you don't want me to sort of take over your pacemaker, pay me this number of Bitcoin. And then the third bucket, and this is really where sort of Homeland Security comes into play, but those who might seek to use sort of IoT to cause physical harm and the intersection of IoT devices with critical infrastructure, both the reliance by critical infrastructure entities on IoT devices, and also the potential that IoT devices could be used to target critical infrastructure. And so, when you think about the different risks that we face and the different threat actors, I think the solution, the security solution to those looks different. And I think we have to think about it in terms of what are the options for securing devices and how to make them more secure, but also looking at what are the other elements of government power and how can we seek to sort of identify and seek to eliminate or change the behavior of the potential malicious actors.
So my next question is for you as well. So does the government need to do more independent verification and validation of the IoT device that it procures? So is something like a FedRAMP for IoT appropriate?
So I think the default answer to any question is, can the government do more or better at something is almost always yes. So I think, yes, we can, sort of do better in terms of the federal government and thinking about how we're procuring and using and securing IoT devices. I think one of the biggest challenges in the IoT space is how do we incentivize better security for IoT manufacturers. And so when we're thinking about what are the possible levers for how to increase the security of devices by default, I think you can look at a whole range of possibilities. Everything from certification programs to sort of cyber insurance to certainly in some sectors regulation might be the answer. But also, how can the government use its purchasing power to try to drive better security? So I think that absolutely, when we're looking at what are all the ways that we can potentially incentivize better security in IoT and other internet-connected devices, I think the government thinking about how it can do a better job in terms of what it's procuring and what requirements it's imposing on vendors is certainly part of that conversation.
Josh?
So two things. One, about how the government can use their purchasing power. One of the things in that survey that I mentioned that we both contractors and agencies alike identified as a problem here is that they cannot, based on their procurement abilities, they cannot buy the newest technologies. They can't necessarily buy the best technologies when they need them, and they don't necessarily have the technical expertise to keep them up to date and secure. So one of the ideas that was floated was basically allow agencies to buy connected services rather than connected products, which puts the onus of security on these private companies that could maybe do it better than the government can. But tying it back to what you said about incentivizing companies to take security seriously, one of the things we'd really like to see, I guess, on a legislative level is, at least on the consumer-facing side, require companies that sell connected consumer devices to publish security policies, just like they publish privacy policies. Because that doesn't mean they'll have good security. It doesn't mean that consumers will read them or understand them, because we know they don't do that with privacy policies. But it does mean that it does create that market incentive. So Consumer Reports will read these policies. They're not going to recommend the fridge that doesn't encrypt all the data from it. And that also makes companies more aware of what they're going to be held accountable for should they be hacked and come before the FTC. And if they weren't abiding by what they said in their stated security policy, then they can be punished for it. And I think that's a great way to get all these companies to start taking it seriously and not, as I mentioned, just checking the box.
John?
I think the procurement is a great way to help address the issue, and this is something we counsel a lot of our clients about, how to put language into their procurement documents for whatever they're buying, specifying the requirements of security. One of the first organizations that responded to this was a retailer who got hit on a supply chain attack where the attacker came in through their HVAC vendor. And subsequent to that, they took this broader view of risk and they started to specify that their suppliers had to have a minimum level of security capability to follow best practices when it comes to security so that they did not introduce vulnerabilities into that client's environment. And so largely we've been working with many members of the IoT space to do this, both on the product side and then on the end user side. So one that I can talk about publicly is Mayo Clinic. Mayo Clinic is building a minimum requirement for medical device security. And so those minimum standards will likely be adopted by other people in the industry because it's something very simple to point to. So not only can the federal government help address this problem by using the language within their own procurement vehicles, but also having a standard out there for procurement of, say, secure vehicles or secure medical devices or anything else that the government buys in bulk, and allowing other people to reference that as a minimum standard requirement.
Some people have suggested that we hack and patch vulnerable devices. What's your thought around that? And does that decision change given the exponential growth in vulnerable devices?
So my thought there is in some circumstances that is reasonable and appropriate, but that has to be a period of high conflict, high risk. As a general practice, I don't think that is appropriate. The better approach there is to make sure that the entities who are not updating their devices in a secure manner, who are leaving vulnerabilities present, face consequences. And that can be through the form of liability, through consumer protection actions. I think there's a variety of avenues with which those, let's say, careless or negligent product companies can be held accountable for their actions.
Is that the approach today? Like, how can companies that have these vulnerable devices be held accountable?
So I think today they're largely not, and we did some public research on a home alarm system where the wireless connectivity between the sensors and the keypad was not secure. We publicly published that. The only way that this particular provider of the system could fix it was to replace the physical devices. They had no way to do secure over-the-air updates. They still haven't replaced them. They've largely ignored the problem. I continue to see their advertising on TV, relatively popular shows.
You can't tell us who the company is?
If you go look at our blog and see who it is, I'm not going to name names up here unless it's in a friendly way.
Ask him after this panel is, off camera.
But I think going forward, the focus has to be more on holding people accountable, establishing best practices, and communicating those failures. There are going to be circumstances where I think the very reasonable approach is to go take control of that malicious device and stop the malicious activity.
How would DHS address that kind of issue?
So
you're responsible for certain critical infrastructure.
So I think that I agree with a lot of the points that were made in terms of the importance of device manufacturers having a strategy for how they are going to sort of handle updates to their products, the hardware, the software, and or how they're going to deal with sort of vulnerabilities that are discovered after the fact. Right? Even if you've got the best security in the world, right, there are going to be vulnerabilities that are going to get discovered down the road. And so it's important for developers, for manufacturers to have a strategy for how to deal with that. And I think another important aspect is to encourage transparency about that. Right. So being clear with sort of what your expectations are for your suppliers in terms of vulnerabilities in their products that are being discovered and those being communicated to you, and how you are communicating with people that are taking your product and embedding it in the things that they're selling or the consumers that are using your device. And we start getting into sort of what's the way to incentivize behavior, and whether it's sort of third parties, certification, or sort of the consumer reports type sort of assessment of who's got sort of the right policies in place for those types of things. I think a lot of that will hopefully shrink the universe that we're talking about in terms of those devices for which there is no way to sort of to patch or update. And I think in terms of, I think there are a lot of challenges with this idea of sort of forced third-party patching, not least of which sort of what's the sort of who's going to do it and under sort of and under what authority. But hopefully we can get the universe of devices that we're worried about to a much smaller, more manageable level, and then I think you get into questions of what's the threat and who are the people that might be authorized to take some action, in
those circumstances.
A drastic scenario. Yeah.
And I think, point relative to the regulatory, so we're talking about patching devices that are insecure. So a common issue comes up in medical devices. So they're a combination IT and a cyber-physical system in many cases. So these devices have a very significant and intense regulatory review and approval before they can be used to provide healthcare services. That is a huge problem in actually securing them from a cybersecurity standpoint. So many times these are common off-the-shelf technologies in these devices, which patches are available for, but those devices cannot be patched in the field because they would have to undergo a whole second FDA review in order for it to be cleared for use in providing healthcare services again. So this is an example of where the regulatory are basically at odds. So the FDA has good intents and a good program, and then we're trying to do the same thing on the cyber side, and they're actually impeding each other.
Josh, anything you want to add?
I can't really contribute to the hack and patch debate, but I think the FDA's got a really interesting example about how you can prioritize your efforts to basically adopting a harms-based approach. So the FDA, like the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or whatever that office is, they published guidance saying if you produce connected medical devices, unless it's designed to collect sensitive information, treat a disease, not just like help you manage your weight or something, or like a fitness tracker, then you don't really need to be subject to this kind of oversight just because the data involved is not necessarily severe enough. It couldn't be used to cause enough harm. If the government is going to be figuring out about what actually warrants like these kind of extreme fixes, it really needs to divide up like what is actually something that could be harmful and what is just like this benign connected device out there in the world.
What do you see as the biggest challenge for government when it actually gets more involved in the IoT space?
As I mentioned, strategic leadership is a huge one. Regulatory clarity. Can't use conflicting definitions. A lot of people call it regulating by buzzword, which I mean, I understand the desire to encourage best practices by saying these catchy things, but that does not really mean anything unless you're actually providing specifications. In terms of standard setting, what we don't want to see is government-led standards. They can definitely serve as a really valuable coordinator, bringing people to the table and coordinating stakeholders. But these practices should be industry-led, and they should be flexible enough for there to be enough buy-in and also to have it be innovation-friendly. But again, another one of the biggest things that we identified that's preventing the government from doing as good a job as they could is human capital. They don't really have the technical talent to necessarily make the best decisions, whether it's on the ground or it's in a leadership position.
Do you agree that it should be industry-led?
So I think absolutely that I think like much of the standards development, I think that the more that the effort can be led by the industry, then I think then that's accomplishes sort of the better result at the end of the day. I think the biggest challenge for the government is just going to be the sort of the speed of innovation and being able to sort of constantly be on the cutting edge of what is a fast evolving space and trying to find a way to foster and not impede that innovation, but yet finding ways that we can build security and to protect against these sort of really serious, legitimate, national threats or risks to the nation. And I think the development of industry standards is a huge piece of that. And I think other ways that the government and industry can find ways to work collaboratively and advance both innovation and security is definitely the challenge that we face.
John, as you're on the industry side?
So I would agree with Thomas that the rate of change is probably the number one concern for the government. But I'll go down a different route. My second one, since you already discussed that, I think a major challenge is it's not going to be either industry or government. There's a role for both. And then finding that right balance is going to be the hard thing to do. One of the number one problems I see is information sharing. The government is terrible in information sharing. So most of the organizations I talk to, critical infrastructure, most important and relevant companies within critical infrastructure businesses do not understand the threats or vulnerabilities that are present today. And I see that as a failure of government to be able to take intelligence and share it in a productive manner whereby those organizations can make the appropriate prioritization of resources and go forward with a resolution.
I'd like to open up the floor to questions. So Sally has a mic in the back, so if you raise your arm, tell me your name and your organization. And make sure the mic is on.
Hi, I'm Lou from the Defense Department. You talked about DHS has broad strategic guidance for industry and about how a lot of this should be industry-led. Is it difficult to have this conversation without providing some technical options and without having that kind of that technical discussion? So in order to reach out to industry, in order to encourage IoT security, do you have to be talking about things like public key exchange and lightweight cryptography, the things that are really going to make a difference in IoT security?
So I would say that I think there are sort of venues where those conversations are happening. In addition to the DHS principles that I mentioned, NIST issued a document yesterday that's sort of a technical engineering security document that I think is at a much more technical level. The NTIA is engaged in a sort of multi-stakeholder process to look at issues related to sort of IoT security in a much more iterative and technical dynamic way with various stakeholders. So I think the answer is yes. We need to sort of find ways to have a conversation at multiple levels, and I think that we're working to do that. A challenge for the government is always to try to coordinate across all of our efforts, and I think we could do a better job at doing that. And I think that something that we're going to certainly prioritize going forward is trying to make sure that all of our various government efforts are well coordinated.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Tim Rideout from the German Marshall Fund. As far as incentivizing good behavior, I'm curious, sort of, what do you see as the main stumbling blocks? Is it that it's so hard to write regulations and legislation when the specs keep changing? You can't, it's not like building a wall; it's constantly evolving. Is it that people simply don't want to pay the cost of more security? Where are the main holdups? Is it also a problem just disseminating information so the average user is taking the basic precautions to remain secure, or something else?
I'll take that one first. I think one of the biggest challenges is quite honestly just kind of how the marketplace works. So some of the smaller IoT providers we work with don't care about security because they have venture funding. They need to get that minimal viable product out the door. That's all that matters. They have to ship X units by Y date or they're not going to get their second round. And in many cases, it's really that simple.
And to reiterate, I think market incentive is going to be the biggest driver behind this. But as we've seen, just a couple weeks ago, the risk of being hacked is not strong enough an incentive for them to actually implement good enough cybersecurity. So any sort of mechanisms that could make that financial carrot more appealing to these companies. So whether it's by publishing security policies, whether it's very clear guidance from the FTC about what you will and will not be published for, making it clear that negligence could be tantamount to actual malicious behavior. There are a couple ways to do it. There's no one solution, but basically tying it to whether or not these companies can make money, I think, is the biggest way.
We talk about the dynamic is different depending on what type of IoT you're talking about. I think one of the challenges is that, especially in the sort of consumer IoT space, that the risk or the cost of insecurity is not borne by, frankly, right now, either the manufacturer or the user, right? So in the case of the DDoS attacks, right, the cost that was borne by those insecure devices, was not sort of either the builder or the user. It was a third party, and so it makes it a little bit harder to maneuver the incentives.
More questions?
Thanks. Jonathan Clifford with Information Technology Industry Council. Going back to, you were hitting on cyber insurance, and I'd kind of be interested to see your take on that. Do you see that following the seatbelt analogy and how auto companies didn't pay out in accidents for people that didn't wear seatbelts? That was the impetus for people wearing their seatbelts as we know them today. Do you see cyber insurance following that same model, or is there some different iteration that kind of takes both the carrot and the stick approach?
So that's a great question. That's something that's a very active area of discussion right now. And so if you're not familiar, FICO actually just came out with a cyber risk score for organizations. It's relatively unsophisticated, it's brand new, but that's the right approach. And so there should be a appropriate premium for cyber risk insurance relative to the risk that the underwriter is taking on. Right now it's very difficult for organizations because there's not lots of hard data about those risks and impacts for the actuarial teams to work with. But as that becomes more prevalent and we have a better understanding of that risk, we can make the appropriate value judgment and charge a appropriate premium relative to the risk that, say, a new IoT company might introduce with their product versus somebody who's very established and has a very sophisticated security program for developing the products.
Hi, Sean McCormick from the Army. I have a simple layman's question. I'm curious of your thoughts. My phone here doesn't have a physical switch to interrupt the current from the battery to whatever makes it work. I'll admit my laymaness there. So would that be an example of something we could conceivably regulate in the sense that there would have to be some sort of manual switch for these consumer devices? Obviously, it wouldn't work for the industrial controls.
So quite honestly,
switch?
that's something I think about frequently, and there's two examples where I think about it. Cameras and microphones. So the exfiltration of in-the-room material, that's a very active area of focus by a lot of nation states today. Having the capability to be able to physically interrupt the operation of those couple devices is very, very important. We have seen active exploitation in the wild of phones and other types of devices where they're exfiltrating audio from the room, that they appear to be off, but they're really on. They're still transmitting. So absolutely, that's something that can make a difference. Now, regulating that, I'm not sure that's the right thing to do. But if consumers have a choice in the marketplace, I suspect a lot of them would choose the capability to physically interrupt the operation of some of those components.
And just quickly, while you're, I mean, there's certainly an analogy to the industrial control systems, where like there is very conscious decisions about which control systems should be sort of internet connected and not, yep. And the ability to sort of ensure that certain systems, and this is almost never true in practice, are actually air gapped and not connected to the broader internet. So.
And it reminds me of the question that we had the debate years ago about the internet kill switch. Yes,
Hi, my name's Stacy Colvin, and I just did a careers change and got a master's from Georgetown in emergency disaster management. So my question is, when you think about the industry, the risk to industry, what efforts or focus, if any, is the government or industry doing from a preparedness standpoint? So when something is penetrated and there is a problem, there is a preparedness plan in place to respond quickly.
So I don't know if this is sort of specific to IoT, but certainly there's been lots of work underway the last several years to make sure that we have a national plan, a national strategy to how to respond to cyber incidents, and most significantly cyber incidents that have physical consequences. So the president issued PPD 41 within the last 6 or so months that sort of lays forward the government's plan for how to respond to significant cyber incidents. The Department of Homeland Security is currently drafting a national cyber incident response plan that, again, tries to lay out how the government, but also works with federal government, but also working with state and local governments and with private sector and industry and international partners, really, to respond to cyber incidents, whether they're IoT driven or not.
One more question, Frank Uncle. You get your last chance. All right. Well, I would like to thank you, a big thank you to the panelists. Thanks for the really interesting conversation. I really appreciate it. And thanks to the audience who participated. Thanks.